All right. Well, I think it's 2:01. I'm going to go ahead and get started and welcome everybody to the Prospective Applicant webinar for the Infrastructure and Capacity Building Challenge Grant opportunities offered by National Endowment for the Humanities. And I'm so glad that you were all able to join us. It looks like we might have a couple more people logging in. But I will speak slowly until everybody gets on. So I am Tatiana Ausema. I am a senior program officer in the Office of Challenge Programs, and I'm glad that you were able to join the webinar. I hope that this answers some of your questions about applying for challenge programs at NEH. And we're joined today also by the director of the Office of Challenge Programs, Stephanie Walker. So I'm going to turn it over to her for a few preliminary welcomes before we get started.
Hello, thank you, Tatiana. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for attending. I welcome you to this pre-application webinar for Infrastructure and Capacity Building Challenge Grants. Even though NEH has been operating at a 100% telework status for, yes, a whole year and a half now, we have continued to run our programs and continue to make significant awards supporting all areas of the humanities. And today we hope to give you helpful information about the revised guidelines for the Infrastructure and Capacity Building Challenge Grants. And we all look forward to hearing about your creative projects. Remember that you're welcome to contact the Challenge Office at any time with your questions. And that's all I'll say for now. And with this brief hello, I'll turn it back over to Tatiana to lead you into the details of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thanks for being with us for this webinar today. Just a couple housekeeping notes before we launch into the content. If you haven't used Teams Live before, the platform doesn't allow participants to be on camera or microphone. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the question box. We have Stephanie and other NEH staff behind the scenes that may be able to answer some questions as they come in. And I'll be sure to leave time for some Q&A at the very end. If you enter in your questions, then Stephanie will read them and we'll respond to them if there's time. If you'd like real-time closed captioning, there's a button in the lower corner to turn on captions. And in addition, a recording and transcript of the webinar will be available on the program page for challenge programs within a few days, should you wish to rewatch or share information with colleagues. Finally, please go ahead and make a note of the email challenge@neh.gov. I'll mention that a couple of times. That is the best way to contact all of us, challenge@neh.gov. Send additional questions there and we'll get back to you with a response or set up a time for a phone call. During the next 40 minutes or so, I'll be discussing both capital projects and digital infrastructure notice of funding opportunities, or NOFOs. And while these are two distinct opportunities, they have many of the same similarities and most of the application requirements are the same. So I'm going to begin with an overview of both the capital projects and digital infrastructure grant program. Some considerations that you may want to think about as you start to develop your project, the process of applying for a challenge grant, and then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the review process and review criteria, ending with some tips and resources, and finally some question and answer time. All of the information that I'm going to discuss today can be found on the program information page on NEH's website. So from the NEH homepage, click on Grants in the upper right-hand corner, which will take you to an option to search by program or divisions. Challenge Programs is the first listing on that page. This program page highlights a few changes to the infrastructure and capacity building grant program that have occurred in the past year. And one of the changes that we're most excited about is actually the reason for this webinar. We've added a second deadline. You can only apply to a single deadline and one NOFO, Notice of Funding Opportunity, per calendar year. However, resubmissions for applications that were deemed ineligible for May 2021 and therefore did not go through the competition are allowed for this September 28th, 2021 deadline. So we're very glad to be able to offer a second deadline to give you and our fellow workers in the humanities more time to develop applications. The purpose of the Challenge Grants program is to strengthen the institutional base of the humanities by enabling infrastructure development and capacity building. The awards aim to help institutions secure long-term support for core activities and expand efforts to preserve and create access to outstanding humanities materials. The program funds two distinct types of projects, each with its own notice of funding opportunity. The first is capital projects, and capital projects is the bricks and mortar part of Challenge and what most people know of as the NEH Challenge Grant Program. The capital projects supports design, purchase, construction, restoration, or renovation of facilities for humanities activities. This includes buying and installation of related movable and permanently affixed equipment for exhibiting, maintaining, monitoring, and protecting collections, whether on exhibit or in storage. It provides funding for critical building systems such as electrical, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, security, life safety, lighting, utilities, telecommunications, and energy management. It does not support exhibitions. So if you're planning a specific exhibition, that would be in our Division of Public Programs, but permanently fixed equipment such as vitrines and storage equipment is eligible as part of this program. Sample projects in the capital projects notice of funding opportunity might include purchase or construction of this new building, the renovation of a gallery space, build out of a humanities center within a larger building, or renovation of an existing historic house, site, or landscape. Digital infrastructure supports the maintenance, modernization, and sustainability of existing digital scholarly projects and platforms. Some examples of eligible activities would be development and modernization of digital architecture. So you might pay developers to rewrite your software. Improvements to data management, such as changing records from MARC to RVF format. Upgrading software and hardware systems, such as purchasing a new server or new licenses. Improving user existing content, so making the user interface easier to navigate, more modern. Training and outreach to teach more people to use your system, but there should already be an established audience. Finally, digital infrastructure could be used for digital preservation, changing data formats, converting data formats to conform to preservation standards, and all of the personnel costs associated for these. What you'll notice in everything I read off for the digital infrastructure is that they're existing digital scholarly projects and platforms. If you're interested in doing preliminary digitization or developing a preservation plan, that would be funded through the Office of Preservation and Access or Digital Humanities. And if you're not sure, that's fine. You can reach out to us and we can help you match your project with an appropriate program. Fundraising is what sets challenge programs apart from most of the other programs at National Endowment for the Humanities, and it's what puts the challenge in challenge grants. Having funds to match is a great motivator for potential donors, for board members, and it can help expand your base of support within the community and nationally. Successful applications must raise third-party non-federal funds in order to receive funds from NEH. Applicants can request up to $750,000, and the matching ratio required to release funds depends on your institution type and the amount requested. Historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and Hispanic serving institutions are eligible for a one-to-one match regardless of the amount requested from NEH. In this scenario, successful applicants must raise $1 in gifts for every $1 they're requesting from NEH. All other applicants must raise $3 for every $1 for requests up to $500,000 and $4 for every $1 in requests from $500,001 to $750,000. So in this graphic here, if you request $500,000 from NEH, you'll be responsible for raising $1.5 million for a total project cost of $2 million. In your application, you'll propose a fundraising schedule, also known as a match and release schedule, as part of your application. If your organization has a development office, we strongly recommend you meet with them to discuss your fundraising plans and bring them into the application from the very beginning. It'll make your application stronger and your capital campaign much stronger as well. And it's important to note that up to 10% of project funds can be used to offset the costs of fundraising. Challenge grants are complex. I think that you probably have already figured that out. And if you're attending today's webinar, there's a good chance you may already have a project in mind. And perhaps you've talked about it with your board of trustees. Must involve input from a whole project team. And this likely includes all of these people I just mentioned: administration, boards, facilities staff, members of the public. If you're doing a digital project, you'll also need to have expertise in that area. And we would encourage you to involve every member of your team in the planning and grant writing process. Just like a successful team involves a wide range of voices, a successful application brings together disparate threads of fundraising, long-term strategic planning, project management, and long-term sustainability into a coherent, compelling, and concise narrative. A strong application will clearly lay out both the project activities and fundraising and align them with past planning and future goals. A detailed explanation of review criteria is found in the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and I'll discuss it a little bit later. But I want to spend a few minutes focusing on a few general key areas that staff and reviewers look for in challenge applications and that we'd like you to consider as you're planning your project. The first thing we want to make sure that you're considering as you develop your project is the humanities significance. We are the National Endowment for the Humanities, and so the humanities focus of your organization and the focus of your project should be front and center in your application. Challenge applications ask for a lot of technical information about your building, plans, collections, digital migration plans, workflow, but don't forget to tell the story of your collections or programs too. Why are they important? Who uses them? For collections that might be outside the bounds of the traditional humanities, talk specifically about how your proposed project is going to serve humanities programs, collections, individuals, and how it will advance your long-term goals. So, for example, if you have a science museum and some of your exhibits might be hands-on, talk to us about those exhibits and how this expansion or building or renovation is going to support your humanities exhibits, the history of science, the history of scientists, and the humanities themes that you'll explore through this project. The next important consideration is the scope of your project. So for some projects, the NEH funding plus your match is going to cover the entire cost of your project. So the slide with the house where it was $500,000 from NEH and you're raising $1.5 million, that total project cost of $2 million may cover the entire project. But for many projects, it may be much larger. You may have a $70 or $80 million building project and capital campaign. And so as you're thinking about applying to NEH, think about what specific activities are going to be supported through this grant and the matching funds. In the $2 million example, what part of your larger project is that $2 million going to cover, and how are you going to present that as part of your larger project in the application? Tell us how you determined that this was the right time to do this project. How does it align with long-term strategic plans and goals? And then what specifically is going to happen at the end of the NEH portion of the project? Are you going to be able to start programming right away, or do you still have more construction? This year, we've added an attachment where we ask you to give us specific deliverables and outcomes that will be funded through the NEH portion of your project. So as part of that, we'd like you to be very clear with us about, in the $2 million example, what specifically is going to be covered by that $2 million? Is it going to be the roof and window replacement? Is it going to be, in this case, the expansion of a historic house? Is it going to be development of an archive? So be clear in both your budget narrative and in these deliverables what that will cover. The third important consideration is the timeline. We ask for a work plan as part of your project application package, and we'll look to see if the dates on the work plan, your budget, and the period performance all align. Are you fundraising at the right time in order to be able to start your project when you say you will? Have you allowed for sufficient time for fundraising, for planning, and particularly compliance with any applicable federal, state, and local regulations? So, challenge grants require two distinct but overlapping timelines. The first timeline is the fundraising timeline. This is the period during which applicants can raise and certify funds in order to receive NEH and matching funds. This begins 5 months prior to the application deadline. So for this round, funds or pledges received for your project since April 28th, 2021 can be used to meet your match. This doesn't mean that you can't be fundraising for other parts of your project that aren't part of the NEH before that, but if you'd like to use the funds for certification, they must be pledged or received after April 28th. The second timeline is the period of performance, which is when the project activities will occur outside of fundraising. For this round of challenge grants, the period of performance cannot start earlier than July 1st, 2022, and will extend no longer than 5 years beyond that period. Your work plan, fundraising schedule, and period of performance should all align and reflect all of the time necessary to complete all activities proposed in your application. The final important consideration that you need to make sure you have in your application is to tell us about your fundraising capacity. As I mentioned before, some of you may have a whole development office that has been doing this for a long time. Is this project that you're proposing a development priority? If so, make sure that you tell us that you've brought them in on that. How is the development office going to support this particular project with a number of other institutional goals going on? Some of you may not have a development office. We fund projects that both have development offices and those that don't. You may be relying on your board of trustees or your staff to be doing the fundraising. So who is going to be ultimately responsible? What type of fundraising has your organization done in the past, and how does this fit with your existing donors and sources of income? Will it expand your base of new donors? Think about the types of gifts you may be getting. The gifts, in order to be allowable, must be third-party contributions, and we have an entire Administration of Challenge Grants guidance that's available on our website to help you determine what may or may not be eligible. And for third party, it means that you can't be taking other institutional funds, endowment funds that are from your own organization and applying them to meet your match for challenge funds. They must be third party outside of your organization. We're happy to have conversations with you, but both before, but especially if you do have a successful application, and we'll talk about what types of gifts are allowable if your application is successful, but please do read that Administration of Challenge Grants manual. In challenge programs, we have a number of organization types that are eligible. In order to apply, you must either be a US-based nonprofit organization with 501c3 tax-exempt status. The 501c3 is required. Higher education institutions, state and local governments, federally recognized Native American tribal governments are also eligible. And your organization must have a connection to the humanities, and your project must be humanities-based. You can only apply for one infrastructure and capacity building challenge grant deadline per year, and that applies both to the digital projects as well as the capital projects. However, if you applied in May and received an email that your application was deemed ineligible, you may apply for this September deadline. To be eligible, All applicants must wait 3 years after the end of a previous challenge grant to reapply. So if your organization had a challenge grant that was ending this year, then there's a 3-year waiting period before you can reapply or before you can come back for another one. It doesn't apply to some of the smaller grants that we offered from 2015 to 2017, but it does apply to existing challenge grants and cooperative agreements. And again, if you have any questions, please reach out to us and we can look and see what currently funded projects we have. We are unable to accept any late materials. So if you have someone who's writing a letter of recommendation and they say they aren't going to be able to get it in time, we can't add it to the application after the deadline. So please do apply, get your application packages on time, complete, and check to make sure everything is in the appropriate format. And I can't emphasize that enough. If you get your application in a little bit early, you can go back and check, make sure that everything is in PDF format, things are named properly, they meet the page limits, and it saves you a lot of stress, and we really don't have any flexibility in accepting anything late, even for formatting errors. So there are some major components that you'll need to create and assemble for your application. A full listing of all of the materials is on page 12 to 13 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity. And some of the materials are standard forms, but for many of them, you'll prepare a document and ultimately save it as a PDF for uploading into grants.gov. Please follow the formatting requirements and naming conventions carefully. So the primary part of your challenge grant application is going to be the narrative. The narrative provides a comprehensive framework and description of all aspects of the proposed project. It should be succinct, self-explanatory, and well organized. The narrative is where you're going to lay out exactly what you're going to do. You're going to tell us about your humanities significance. You're going to tell us about your project. You're going to tell us about your fundraising, and you're going to do it all within 8 pages. So you have to think very clearly and concisely as you lay out this information. Your project budget will be submitted using the SF, which stands for Standard Form 424C. Please also submit a budget justification that includes your proposed match and release schedule, as well as a breakdown of cost items that you've included in that SF242C. In your budget justification, explain why those things are necessary as part of your project and how you came up with those numbers. And we recognize that construction projects especially may change over time, but give us the numbers that you have, explain where they came from, and justify them to the best of your ability. Your proposed budget should only include the funds that you're requesting from NEH and your required match. So for larger projects, please designate which part NEH will be supporting. As I said before, if you're requesting $500,000 from NEH and you have a $1.5 million match, we would like to see a total budget of $2 million, even if your project is above and beyond that amount. So decide which portion of your larger project, if possible, what NEH will be supporting, and we're happy to have conversations about that. Your work plan is a separate attachment and should align with your narrative and budget. It must include a schedule with the anticipated start and finish dates and critical milestones for your project, including fundraising, planning, and construction activities. You should build in time to account for environmental and historic preservation review. Capital projects are also going to include some additional attachments, including planning and design and the standard form 429A, which I'll talk about in another slide. Digital projects also must include a data management and sustainability plan. Consult the Notice of Funding Opportunity for how to create that data management and sustainability plan. The data management plan is going to vary significantly depending on what type of digital project you're doing, and that's okay, we know that. Your sustainability plan is to demonstrate institutional commitment. Where is your project going to be in 10 or 20 years? And what is your institution's commitment to it as a legacy, both in terms of staffing and funding beyond the end of the challenge grant? I mentioned in the last slide that there's a standard form 429A that's required for capital projects. This form is required if your project proposes construction, renovation, repair, rehabilitation, ground or ground or visual disturbance. Even if you think your building or your site is not historic, we still need this form in order to determine if the project is subject to review under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. If it is subject to a review, it may take from a few months to a year, and NEH will assist you with the process after an offer of support is made. We use this form in order to determine if the review is required, so please include this. Even if you're convinced that your building, your site is not historic, we must have this form. On the form, please include as much detail as possible regarding your proposed project and any associated historic properties. The more information we have with your application, the faster we may be able to initiate and complete our determination. More information is available on page 24 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity and on the NEH website. So as you prepare your application, we do offer a range of resources to help you better understand Section 106 of the Historic Preservation Act and the National Environmental Policy Act and how it could impact your project timeline or work plan. These can be found on the program resource page for challenge programs and includes a 20-minute presentation that goes through step by step how NEH Historic Preservation Review works. As I noted earlier, if your application is recommended for funding, NEH staff will work with you to comply with these requirements as relevant. That said, it's exceptionally important to build in enough time for this review into your work plan and to understand especially how it might impact projects that already have finalized construction documents or a tight schedule. If that might apply to your project, be sure to watch the recorded information, review the resources, and then reach out to us with any questions. There are a number of other resources on our program resource page that we hope you'll take full advantage of in preparing your application. You'll find the Notice of Funding Opportunity for both capital projects and digital infrastructure. You'll find frequently asked questions that document what will perhaps answer some of your questions you might have about submission and some of the details. You'll find instructions for how to fill out that SF 429 form. And you'll also find the Administration of Challenge Grants document that I mentioned before that can give you information about fundraising and eligible gifts. Perhaps most importantly, you'll find sample application narratives. These sample application narratives can be really helpful to see what successful applicants have done and how they've constructed their project, especially for larger projects where you're coming to NEH for a small portion of an overall initiative. In the past year, we've changed the format of the narrative somewhat, so we don't have any narratives that use the new format, but I think they're still really helpful for thinking about how you might propose your project and communicate it to NEH and our reviewers. We also have sample work plans on this site that may be helpful as you think about how to put all of this information, the fundraising, period of performance work into a concise document and add it as the work plan. So there's 2 sample documents there. Applications for NEH grants, like many federal grants, are submitted through a web portal called grants.gov. It's a fairly smooth system, but it would be good for you to spend some time getting familiar with it before you submit your application. You need to register at least a month before applying. We strongly urge you to apply early, as it could get pretty overwhelmed in the 5 minutes before the midnight deadline. If your institution has a grants office, they can help. They do this a lot, and grants.gov support is available 24/7. If you're not sure if your organization has a grants.gov account, ask around, figure out who has the password, and make sure that they know that you are planning on applying so that they can get anything updated in order to prepare for your application. As I mentioned before, submit early and ensure that you have a confirmation from grants.gov that your application was submitted. Check your file formats and make sure that and ensure that your file is in PDF form, that it's properly named, And you can resubmit your application package up until the deadline. But as I said before, no materials can be added after the deadline. So if you notice that there's an error or you get a notice back from grants.gov that your application, you didn't get the confirmation, up until the deadline, you can resubmit and we will take the most recent submission. So confirm the submission, make sure you have the email when it's confirmed. One of the challenges of challenge grants is how to complete the supplementary cover sheet that you'll be asked to include with your application. So here we've included screenshots and they're also on our program resource page with directions on how to properly fill out the budget request on the supplementary cover sheet because it's not straightforward, it's in government speak. So you'll find the cover sheet under the mandatory forms on grants.gov. I'll go through this quickly, but remember the webinar and the transcript will be posted on our website, so you can refer back to this as a resource. Since Challenge doesn't allow outright funds, the first highlighted box should be left empty, and you'd put the amount requested from NEH in the second and third boxes. Then, in the fourth box, you'd indicate the amount that you'll fundraise to receive those funds based on the matching ratio your institution qualifies for. Then, in the last box, you put the total project cost, which is the sum of the NEH award and the matching funds you will raise. I'd like to touch quickly on the review criteria that our panelists will use to evaluate your application. These are included in a table on page 9 of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and you'll see that each narrative section corresponds to one of those criteria. To the best of your ability, be sure to clearly include each one of these elements in your application. You can even use the criteria as subject headings in your narrative for clarity. The reviewers will be generalists, sometimes former project directors or participants, or individuals from a similar institution type. Be sure to write for this knowledgeable but generalized audience. Try to avoid gaps or asking reviewers to make assumptions about your project, expertise, or staffing. I'll often say to applicants that you don't want to confuse reviewers because they're always going to assume the worst. So be very clear and don't assume that reviewers are going to know your staff, your institution, your collection, or your programs. If possible, ask a colleague to review your application with these criteria in mind and ask for feedback on how well your proposal responds to each of these areas. So now you've assembled and submitted your application. You have a confirmation from grants.gov. What next? All applications for NEH grants go through a lengthy review process, which has several stages. The first step is going to be that NEH staff will review for eligibility and completeness. We'll make sure that all of the required forms are there and that you're an eligible organization and that you're applying for the appropriate match ratio. We'll make sure that all of the forms are there and that they meet the appropriate page length. The next step, and it's central to the work that we do at NEH, is the peer review panel. During this peer review process, evaluators will read the applications, write comments, and post a rating. They'll then meet virtually right now to discuss the applications and then provide feedback and comments to NEH staff. It's important to note that reviewers do not make funding decisions or recommendations. They apply the review criteria to what you've put in the application and provide feedback to NEH staff in the form of comments. NEH staff will then review those comments and make our own recommendations. Those recommendations are considered by the National Council on the Humanities, which is a group of 26 individuals that are scholars in the humanities nominated by the President and approved by the Senate. That National Council will then make recommendations to the endowment's chairman, who takes all of this into consideration and will make the final decision on which to fund. It's a long process, and we know that it takes a long time to hear back from us, but it allows for a rich review and good stewardship of taxpayer dollars. I hope this explains why it takes about a year between when your application is going to be submitted to when you're going to hear the results of the competition. After grants are announced, you can request comments from your evaluators, and if the proposal is not funded, the reviewer comments can help you think about how to revise your proposal for next time. So we're hitting just about the 40-minute mark, so I'm going to wrap up with just a few tips and reminders. First, reach out early with a short description of your project. For phone consultations with NEH staff, it's helpful to have both the project director and the development person on the call. This is not a requirement, but it does help to make sure that your project and timeline is aligned with the NEH review process and eligibility. Please carefully read the materials on our website, the notice of funding opportunity, frequently asked questions, sample narratives, sample work plans, etc. It's dense but helpful. Pay attention to the file names, budget convention, page limits, and other details. Involve all project participants in the application draft. If you work as a grant writer, be sure that the grant writer is talking to the engineers or digital specialists or fundraisers. Use NEH's search feature to find other institutions that may have already received a challenge grant and reach out to them. Send in a draft for comments, and this is the most timely recommendation I have for everybody that's on this webinar. We do read drafts in this program. The drafts are optional, but applicants have reported that the review and comments are helpful, and the draft deadline for this round is August 17th, 2021. Finally, successful or not, please request panelist comments. Projects we hear all the time, successful or not, really get a lot out of those panelist comments. They help refine the project, provide helpful feedback on what really resonated, areas they could work on. So please do request those comments. So I'll wrap up now with an offer to answer some questions, but please don't hesitate to reach out to us either by phone or email. The best way to reach us is through the challenge email address, which is challenge@neh.gov. You can see here on this slide. And that email will be forwarded or responded to by one of the program officers or our staff, and we can answer questions that way or set up a phone call. And over the course of asking questions, I'd ask that any specific questions about your project, such as is gift XYZ eligible, or we have this particular project in mind, will the timeline work? Submit those to us by email so that we can have enough information to answer accurately. But general questions I would be happy to answer if you put them in the Q&A, and I believe Stephanie is still with us to read out any questions that may have come in while I was speaking. So I want to just thank you all very much right now for your attention so far, and I look forward to answering any questions that you might have.
So Tatiana, yes, we've answered a number of questions and put them in the published area, but one that just came in now is, what is the anticipated turnaround time for feedback from the draft application submitted on the 17th?
That's a really good question. Generally a couple weeks. We try, I think 2 weeks as a rule of thumb, depending on how many drafts we get. It's hard to say for sure, but a couple weeks. What will usually happen is you'll submit the draft to challenge@neh.gov. I think I left that out. You do not submit your draft via grants.gov. We don't see it that way. So challenge@neh.gov, it will be assigned to a program officer, and then the program officer will contact you via email to either set up a phone call or provide written responses to your draft.
And I'll add, you're welcome to submit your draft before the 17th too.
Yes, please do. If you think that you'll have it ready, please go ahead and submit it before the 17th.
Another question, Tatiana, is within the budget justification, is there a preferred way to present the portion to be requested from NEH and the portion that will be fundraised? So that's in the budget justification, not the cover sheet.
That's also a really good question. So in your budget justification, we'd like you to provide a match and release schedule. The match and release schedule, there's examples in the notice of funding opportunity, but it's going to be a table that goes year by year. So if you have a 4-year project, it'll be year 1 through 4. On one line, we'll ask what you are requesting from NEH that year. On the other line, we'll ask you to include what will be fundraised, and that will be your match and release schedule for that project if funded. In terms of explaining which line items come from the NEH portion versus the fundraised portion, for our purposes, again, let's use that $2 million project example, we look at the entire project as that $2 million, so we don't ask individual line items to be assigned to NEH funding versus your fundraised portion.
And Tatiana, there's another good question to answer here for everyone. If funds are awarded, are projects subject to federal requirements, including Davis-Bacon?
That's a great question, and the answer is yes. Any contracts for labor in excess of $2,000 are subject to Davis-Bacon. So for those who are unfamiliar with the Davis-Bacon Act, there is some guidance on our website as well, but it's a fair wage law that federal contracts are subject to. So if you are getting estimates and they only apply to labor. So if you're working with an architect, if you're working with a consultant for a digital reformatting project, Davis-Bacon does not apply to that. It applies to the trades. So if you are working with a contractor and there's going to be roofers, there's going to be equipment installation, Davis-Bacon applies to all of those contracts. So when you get estimates, be sure to tell your general contractor or your subcontractors that there may be federal funding so that they can incorporate that into their estimate of the project costs.
And another question that we get several times, can state and city funding serve as a match?
So the answer is going to be, it depends, but generally, if that city and state funding is not a pass-through for federal funding, so for example, there are state funds that can be, the state is a pass-through for federal funding. Appalachian Heritage Commission, I believe, is one. There's others, but assuming that it is funds from a state or a local government and that your organization is not part of that state or local government, generally it could be used as a match. But when it comes to matches, the answer is going to be, it depends most of the time until we can take a look at the specific, if it's a local bond bill or a state grant, the specifics of that grant before we can determine for sure. Let's see, are there other questions? Let's see, I don't hear any other questions. Let me look in the Q&A. Scope and costs that are outside of a scope being requested by this grant. So this looks like a question about project scope and costs beyond, let's say for the $2 million example, that would be above and beyond that. We would like to know the general project costs. So if you have a $60 million project, we'd like to know it's a $60 million project, but we'd like you to focus on the $2 million of what would be coming from NEH and just a general sense of how that larger $60 million project is going to be funded and supported. Great. So it looks like we might have lost Stephanie off of our conversation, but I don't see on my other screen here any other questions that have come up. So with that, I will wait another minute or two if there are any other questions. Otherwise, you always can reach out to us directly at challenge@neh.gov, and we're happy to walk you through this process. And please definitely make use of the resources that we have on our website. And it looks like, Stephanie, are you back with us?
Yes, sorry, I had a momentary electrical interruption. Did you get the question about would you like to know about project scope and costs that are outside the scope being requested by this grant?
Yes, I did just answer that.
Okay, great.
And I didn't see any other questions in the Q&A. Oh, there's a question about, yes, the webinar. If you can view the webinar, this will be available in the next couple days on the Challenge Grants Office of Challenge Programs page. And so you can view it in its entirety. There will be a transcript that you can also read along with it as well.
And there's a question about project timeline. Did that get answered?
No, I'm just seeing that now. So project timeline is November 2021 to September 22. It will depend on kind of the scope of what you're working on and what would be done before the period of performance versus after the period of performance begins in July of 2022. So what I would encourage you to do is send us a message with kind of a just super short overview of your project and where the funding would come from and the timeline, and we can get back to you with some details about that. Great. Well, it looks like we got all of the questions here answered. If you're working on your application, you can't find the answer on our website, please do reach out. We're happy to be as helpful as possible. And we really look forward to reading your drafts in a couple weeks and final submissions September 28th. So thanks again for joining us, and please do share the webinar with anyone else on your team that might be interested. Great. Take care, everyone.